Hey everybody, welcome back to the Flyin Miata Garage. In today's video, we're going to be installing a set of Konis on this 95 Miata. Alright, this video is meant to cover all Konis that we offer. In this particular case, we're installing the Special Active Konis, which is a red shock. We also carry Koni Sports and Koni STRTs. This video will apply to all of them with subtle differences that we'll point out as we go. One thing to note is the Special Actives and the STRTs, they're meant to work with stock springs. And the Koni Sports, or the yellows, they're meant to work with our FM springs. Depending on the shock, you may have adjustable lower perches, and you'll want to reference the documentation that's included with the shocks on where you want your perch ring to be set. Typically, there's going to be a difference between stock non-Bilstein shocks and stock Bilstein shocks, and that perch ring will change depending on what setup you currently have. So let's talk about these shocks a little bit. This is the Special Active Konis, and they come in a kit that includes the shocks, that include the lower perches, little washers to help the bump stops breathe. We include our FM bump stops and a nylock top nut. This customer also opted to replace their worn out stock NA shock mounts with these new versions that we offer. And so we're going to go ahead and install this kit. I'm going to show you one shock installation, front and rear, and it's just mirrored on the other side. So let's now go over our tool list. Over here on my right, I have a number of drivers. Not all of them are required, but a lot of them make the job easier. Various sizes, 3/8 and 1/4 drive. I'm going to have an assortment of sockets. Your typical metric sizes for Miatas are 21, 17, 14, 12, and 10. You'll have a similar assortment of wrenches needed as well. You might need a wobble and an extension. Got a torque wrench for tightening things down at the end. I have a set of internal snap ring pliers. This is only required if you have a set of Konis that have adjustable lower perches and you need to move that perch. I have a punch for helping align bushings before installing hardware, a trim panel tool for gaining access to the upper shock mount in the trunk, got a rubber mallet, big pry bar, and a sturdy block of wood. Now, one last tool you're going to need to safely do this job is a spring compressor. Now, we have access to a fancy wall-mounted unit here. Not everyone's going to have that, so you can typically find some version of spring compressor available for rent from your local auto parts store. Now that we've covered all the tools that you're going to need, let's start with our disassembly. All right, now we're ready to get the car on the lift. We'll get the wheels off and we'll get started with the disassembly. Now, I'm only going to go through the disassembly and assembly of one side, the driver's side. The passenger side is practically the mirror image. So now that we're ready to go, I'm going to start at the shock tower and get the upper shock mount disconnected. So with a 14mm socket, we'll remove these nuts. Now, to get access to the rear shock on the driver's side, we need to remove this panel that covers the fuel filler hose. So in this case, let's remove the carpet cover first. They have some aftermarket panel clips here that will pop out. Take this guy off. Now, to remove the panel, we need to remove a few M6 bolts that use a 10mm socket. And there's also one hiding under here. Sorry, two hiding under here. Now, access still isn't the greatest. We have to get to the two nuts that are down here. Now, to get access to those, it is tricky. I typically use a deep socket on a wobble with a short extension, maybe 3 inches, on an electric ratchet. And you just kind of have to fish it back there and now we'll go ahead and jack up the car and remove our wheels. Because it's still stock lug nuts, we'll use a 21mm socket. We'll do the same thing on the rear. My first step under here is to remove the end link from the control arm so we have sufficient maneuverability of the control arms. So we're going to be using a 14mm socket and or wrenches. Just to make it a little easier, and because we're going to want to reset bushings anyway, I'm going to also break loose this upper bushing. Come on now. Okay. And now with a 17mm socket, we'll remove the lower shock mount. So now we have a block of wood, just a standard 2x4 cut down to 6 inches long or so. We're going to set that on our control arm. We have a long pry bar. We'll hook it underneath the subframe flange and onto that block of wood. And now we can pull down the control arms. So with one hand we'll do that, and with our other hand we'll liberate the shock. And it's out. All right, the process for the front is a little bit different. We are going to first pull down this side of the under tray. So we're going to remove the couple bolts here, as well as there's one under here and a couple at the front. So we're going to drop this side of the under tray because we're actually going to remove this long bolt that goes through the upper control arm bushing. So there's a 21mm bolt head over here, 21mm nut over here. We're going to break those loose and push the bolt through. Now the factory service manual recommends to loosen your alignment bolts bushings, and that the whole suspension will drop and make it possible to take the shock out. I've always found it easier to remove those bolts. That's how I was shown, that's how I've always done it, and it truly is easy. So let's do it that way. So like I said, first things first, pull down our under tray. We're already missing one here, so now we can pull that down. Now we'll work on this big long bolt. Now, typically these are pretty hard to remove, so they take a lot of effort. So typically I'll get a closed end 21mm wrench on it, then get another wrench, closed end, hook it through, and that increases your leverage. That's usually what's required to break those loose. So we will do that now. So we got that loose. Now we will take another 21. Keep track of the washers here. There's the big one, then a little one, then the nut. Now with the nut off, we want to take this bolt and slide it forward. Now this can be a little bit of a sticky process. You just kind of have to wiggle the control arm as you slide it forward. This car has the power steering cooler lines that pass through the sway bar bracket. Typically those you can just sneak by. Worst case scenario, you might have to bend those just a hair. The other problem that you might encounter is if the sway bar bracket bolt extends too far, you may just have to loosen it. And we're actually going to need to do that in our case. So we'll take a 12 mil socket and just lower it down a ways. So now we'll keep going with our bolt until it's all the way through, and we can just leave it in place there. So now we're gonna do the lower shock mount, 17 millimeter socket, 17 millimeter wrench. So this is a nut and bolt setup. So you're gonna need to hold one end while wrenching on the other. Very loud. Get our nut and lock washer. And our bolt. Now our last step before removing the shock is to remove the end link from the sway bar. Typically you only have to do this from one side to allow the suspension to droop enough. So I got two 14 millimeter sockets. Now with everything loose, we're ready to remove our shock. So I'm going to grab the control arm and work it off the subframe. It's kind of hitting the shock now. So now I can push down on the lower control arm. And now my shock upper end is loose. So I can pull it out of the bottom end, angle it toward me, careful not to hit the fender, and work it out of that upper control arm. You can see here I do have a little bit of slack on my brake line. If you don't have slack on your brake line, you might use a bungee cord to hold everything up. But right here we're good. All right, now we're over here at our spring compressor, and we're going to show you how to take the shocks apart and to put them back together with the new components. So first things first, let's get it loaded into our spring compressor. I'm also going to remove this little gasket that they put on the tops of these just so we don't tear it with the compressor. All right, now our shock's loaded into our spring compressor. Now, typically, most people will not have a wall-mounted spring compressor at their disposal. You can typically get spring compressors from various auto parts stores through their tool rental programs, or in some cases you can go to shops and ask them to just swap out shocks for you for a small charge. But we will go ahead and show you how we do it here. So we don't need to compress it much. I can see that a little bit of a gap formed here, so that tells me the spring is compressed. Pop our cap off. In this case, we have a 14 millimeter upper shock nut. Depending on what shocks you have in there, some of them are 14, some of them are 17, so just be prepared to identify what it is to remove it. And now we will slowly raise the compressor. Okay, so these have lifted off, so we are clear. So this is junk. We want to keep this. This is the factory upper bump stop. As you can tell, it's been well used. So this is going in the garbage, and as is the shock. All right, now we have our new shock. Let's put it together. First things first, we need to determine, in this case, where this snap ring goes. Now, as mentioned before, we need to look at the documentation as to what groove is what. In this case, this lower groove that the snap ring is already in is for cars with factory Bilstein suspension, which this car did not have. So we want to move our snap ring up to the upper groove, which is the non-Bilstein factory location. So I've got a pair of clip spreaders here. So I'm going to spread them and get it moved over to the new perch location. Now we'll install our lower perch. This washer here with the split, that is so if you fully compress and you hit your bump stop, it allows air to discharge out through this groove. Otherwise, air could push through the seal and damage the shock. So that just rests on top. Now do a new bump stop. And it just needs to go to where it's past that little landing. And we'll have our new shock mount ready to go. And we'll put our spring all together on the spring compressor. Now, the upper shock mount on NAs has a D-shaped opening, and that is intended to hold the D-shaped shock shaft stationary while you tighten the upper nut. Now, on some cheaper mounts, we've noticed that the D shape is too large to where the shock shaft is able to rotate freely regardless of the D shape. If that ends up happening to you, you'll want to get a little bit of split hose. So I have some oil hose here that is probably 3/8 of an inch. Cut down its length. You want to wrap that around your shock shaft to protect it, because you're also going to need a pair of vice grips. And you'll want to clamp your vice grips onto the shock shaft, and that will hold the shaft stationary while you tighten your nut. So the whole goal here is you do not want to damage the shock shaft. If you damage the shock shaft, that's not covered by the warranty that Koni offers. So be very careful. So let's go ahead and get this put together. Now the tricky part with Konis on a spring compressor like this is the lower perch isn't fixed. So if I just rest it on the lower perch, the shock will fall out the bottom. So you kind of have to have your hands all working together here. We're also going to line up the axis of our lower shock mount. Needs to be in line with the upper shock mount's 2 studs. Now that I'm getting close, I'll need to orient my shaft until the D shape comes through. And now we will install our nut. So now I'm ready to draw the nut on. I'm going to use a hand wrench. It's highly recommended not to use any kind of impact or electric drivers, just because you don't want to have any of the threads get boogered, especially on a D-shaped shaft. That's just a little bit more likely. So I will draw it in. Once I have it drawn on, we're going to go ahead and tighten it down to the torque spec. For this shock, it's 37 pound-feet. You're going to want to look at the reference material that's included with your set of shocks to see what your torque spec is. You want to be extra careful on shocks that have hollow shafts like Koni Sports or the yellows. Okay, now that I'm snug, I'll get my torque wrench. Now at this point, you don't have to still be in the shock compressor. You can bring it over to the bench. Obviously the nut is holding everything together, but I'm gonna go ahead and leave it in for now. we're to spec. Now that we're done with our front shock, we'll do the same process for the rear shock. Shock's in. All right, now that we're all assembled, it's time to get it put back in. So let's not forget our little gasket that goes on the top of the shock mount. Same process as removal. We'll have our block of wood and our pry bar. Pull down, feed the shock into position. Now trying to put it in, our perch is in contact with the upper control arm bolt here, and that's preventing us from getting it fully seated. So I'm actually going to loosen this bolt. Being a rubber bushing, at the end of this job, we will want to tighten this bolt down with the car loaded on its suspension. I am using a 14mm socket and wrench. Now with the bolt out of the way, we should be able to get this in. So much easier. Now if your bushing doesn't fully seat into position down here, you may have to use a punch and just help it a little bit before we put our bolt in. Of course, even though I'm gonna still have to give it a couple love taps. And with a 17mm socket, I'm gonna just get it started. Now I'm gonna get it to snug and then break it loose about 1/4 of a turn. This is a lower bushing that we want to have set with the car at its ride height. So now let's not forget to put our upper control arm bolt back into place. And again, we're not getting it fully tight until we have the vehicle's weight on it. All right, now that our rear shock is in, the last step on the back is to put our sway bar bolt back in. Again, because these are rubber bushings, we are not going to tighten these bolts down until the vehicle is on its weight, so we can tighten them up at ride height. If you have an NB with ball joint style ends, you can go ahead and tighten those up now, since those are not a bushing style end link. Get that end link a little bit looser. Actually, you know what, I'm gonna just disconnect the top. That allows the bottom to line up. So with our bottom lined up, now we can go and readdress the top. Now let's move on and install the front shock. So I have it all ready to go, including our gasket. So I'm going to drop it into the control arm and then just kind of guide the control arm back into position, install my bolts, and then hook everything up. Oh, I should point out, you can see here we have a boss here, a threaded boss. That is for an ABS sensor. This car does not have ABS, so this will be unused. For those who do have ABS, this will point toward the rear of the vehicle. I'm gonna go in and install my lower bolt. Now I'll guide the shock and the upper control arm into position. Install our big bolt washers and nut. And just like on the rear, anywhere we have a bushing that we've loosened, we're not going to tighten the hardware for that bushing until we have the vehicle on its weight on the ground. Now that our big bolt is back in place on the upper control arm, I'm going to reinstall the sway bar bolts that was originally holding it up. I'm going to leave my under tray off until I'm ready to tighten this bolt all the way. All right, last step on the front here before we lower the car is to put our sway bar bolt back in. Because on an NA, these are bushings, again, I'm going to leave those loose until the car's on its weight. If you have an NB with the ball joint style, you can tighten those up right away because those have the ability to pivot. Now we're going to lower the car and install our upper shock mounts nuts. So now we're ready to install the nuts. In this case, this aftermarket shock mounts have new hardware that require a 12mm socket. If you're still using the stock hardware, that's a 14mm socket. Now we'll get those tightened down to the torque spec, which is 22 to 26 pound-feet. So now we'll install the nuts on the rear. Setup to get them installed, again, is an electric ratchet, 4-inch extension, wobble, and a 12mm deep socket. So that's at least started. Then this one on the back. Okay, so those are started. Now we'll get in there with the tool. Now, since the shocks we are installing are non-adjustable, we can go ahead and put in our fuel filler hose protection plate and the carpet section. If you're dealing with adjustable shocks, the adjustment is on the upper portion of the shock shaft, so you're going to want to leave these parts out until you've had a chance to dial in your suspension settings. Now our next step is to tighten down any loose bushings while the vehicle is at its ride height. Now we did loosen a few bushings to be able to make the installation possible, so we want to tighten those down while at ride height. Those are the only bushings we need to worry about on this particular suspension setup, which is the Koni Special Actives, which the vehicle will remain at its stock ride height despite these new shocks going in. Now, if you're doing something like Koni Sports, where your ride height is changing, you will want to break loose all of your control arm bushings to reset them at ride height. Now, there's a few ways that you can do this. You can put your wheels on, but depending on how low your car is or how wide your wheel is, that can make access to the fasteners fairly challenging. The easiest way for us is to use a set of our hub stands. Now, this is an older set of hub stands that I'm going to use for demonstration purposes, A, because it makes it really easy to see, and it makes the job relatively easy to do. You may also use jack stands or a jack. You just want to make sure you're being careful that it won't slip off or fall in any way. So let's get our hub stands on. Now we'll move up to the front, do the same. So now I have all 4 wheels on hub stands. We're ready to lower the car and let it rest at ride height. So now that the vehicle's off the lift arms, that tells us that we are at our ride height. So now let's go tighten our bushings. All right, now I'm ready to torque things down. I'm gonna start with the upper control arm bushing, which will torque down from 34 to 49 pound-feet. We'll then do the lower shock, which is 54 to 68 pound-feet, and then the end link bolts, which are 27 to 39 pound-feet. All right, now we'll move back up front. All right, now we're at the front of the car. Similar process. We got to call out what torque specs we're using for the various bolts. So for our lower shock, it's the same 54 to 68 pound-feet. For the large bolt that mounts the upper control arm to the subframe, that's 87 to 101. And for the end links, it's the same spec as the rear of 27 to 39. So let's do that. Start with the control arm. We'll start with the lower shock. Now we'll do our big bolt. Now we'll do our end link. All right, now I only covered the torque specs of the bushings that we touched on this particular install. Now again, if you're lowering your ride height, you're gonna wanna loosen all of your bushings. And for the full list of torque specs, I will direct you over to the instruction sets we have for the various Koni kits. They have all of the torque specs for all the bushings listed out in those instructions. All right, now we'll go ahead and button up our splash pan. Now we'll zip off our hub stands, install our wheels, get the car back down on the ground and torque the wheels. For our wheels, we'll use a torque spec of 85 pound-feet. Now I've only shown you one side of the car, one front corner, one rear corner. The other side of the car is just about exactly the same. So just follow the same procedure for the passenger side to do all 4 corners. All right, that wraps up this installation of a set of Konis on this 95 Miata. We hope this helped you with your installation. If you have any questions, go ahead and give us a call or send us an email and we'd be happy to help you out. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and like, comment, and subscribe, as we will be doing more videos like this in the future. If you have any ideas for more videos, go ahead and drop them in the comments below. Thanks again for sticking around, and we will see you next time.